Among the many environmental conditions that shaped daily life in the Middle Ages, winter stands out as one of the most formidable forces documented by historians, climatologists, and archaeologists. Medieval communities relied heavily on seasonal cycles for food, labor, and mobility, and the arrival of winter disrupted each of these structures with a severity that is often underestimated in modern interpretations. If you frequently encounter content examining how climate influenced historical societies, you may find this subject aligning closely with themes that continue to recur in pre-modern environmental studies. Understanding why medieval winters were deadly requires situating them within a broader climatic context. The period stretching from the early medieval centuries into the late Middle Ages includes intervals of colder temperatures, irregular harvests, and increased climatic volatility, conditions supported by dendrochronology, ice core analyses, and written accounts preserved in monastic chronicles. These sources record prolonged cold spells, sudden freezes, and seasonal disruptions that affected multiple regions across Europe. Winter in the Middle Ages was not merely a period of low temperature. It represented a seasonal collapse of mobility, trade, agricultural productivity, and communication. Roads became impassable, rivers froze unpredictably, and snow accumulation isolated communities for weeks or months at a time. Without centralized state infrastructure capable of mitigating these effects, individuals depended heavily on stored resources, social networks, and local environmental knowledge. From an academic perspective, winter functioned as an annual stress test for medieval societies. It exposed weaknesses in settlement patterns, food storage systems, housing structures, and medical understanding. Examining these vulnerabilities provides insight into why mortality increased during this season and why communities across Europe developed specific cultural, economic, and technological practices to survive it.
The climatic conditions of the Middle Ages were shaped by broad environmental patterns that varied significantly across time and region. While the medieval period is often associated with the medieval warm period, many areas, particularly in northern and central Europe, experienced extended intervals of colder winters, abrupt temperature shifts, and irregular precipitation cycles. These fluctuations are documented through paleoclimatic evidence, including tree ring data, glacial expansion records, sediment analysis, and isotopic variations in ice cores. Such data reveals that winter temperatures frequently dropped to levels capable of freezing rivers, halting transportation, and damaging stored crops. The absence of modern heating systems, insulation techniques, or widespread access to dense fuel sources meant that households relied on limited supplies of wood, peat, or charcoal, materials that were unevenly available across regions. In densely populated medieval settlements, overexploitation of nearby forests further reduced access to winter fuel, magnifying vulnerability during colder seasons. Climatic variability also influenced agricultural productivity. The medieval farming system depended on predictable seasonal cycles to manage plowing, sowing, and harvesting. When early frosts arrived sooner than expected or snow persisted into spring, crop yields decreased dramatically. This instability created cascading effects, reduced grain production, limited fodder for animals, and strains on community storage capacity. Written records from monastic centers describe recurring anxieties over failed harvests, reflecting the direct connection between climate patterns and survival. Winter conditions additionally affected hydrological systems. Rivers that served as trade routes could freeze unevenly, disrupting long-distance transport and isolating communities. Frozen water mills halted grain processing, while thaw cycles caused flooding that damaged infrastructure. Archaeological studies of medieval settlements reveal patterns of rebuilding and structural adaptation consistent with the challenges posed by winter-related environmental stress. The severity of medieval winters cannot be examined solely through temperature data. Rather, their impact emerges through the intersection of climate, resource availability, and technological limitations. When viewed through this analytical framework, winter becomes not just a natural season, but a structural force that shaped medieval life, economy, and mortality. These climatic realities formed the backdrop against which food shortages, disease patterns, and community isolation developed, conditions that intensified the lethal nature of winter in the medieval world.
Food scarcity was one of the most persistent and dangerous consequences of medieval winter conditions. Agricultural production was inherently seasonal, and the months following the harvest were a period of dependency on stored grain, dried legumes, salted meat, and preserved vegetables. When yields were low or storage was insufficient, entire communities entered winter with limited reserves, creating a structural vulnerability that intensified with every week of cold weather. The medieval agricultural system relied heavily on rye, wheat, barley, and oats, crops whose success depended on predictable climate cycles. Early frosts, excessive rainfall during harvest weeks, or prolonged cold spells could compromise yields, leaving granaries only partially filled. Archaeobotanical evidence from European settlements indicates fluctuations in cereal availability from year to year, with some seasons producing surpluses and others severe shortages. Written accounts from monastic chronicle keepers repeatedly document anxieties over dwindling supplies, especially in northern regions where the growing season was shorter. Preservation methods were limited by technology and resources. Salting required large quantities of salt, which was expensive and depended on trade routes vulnerable to winter disruption. Smoking and drying food demanded controlled environments and consistent fuel supplies, both of which were often unreliable in colder months. Dairy production declined sharply as animals produced less milk during winter, and fresh produce all but disappeared from rural and urban markets. These constraints reduced dietary diversity and weakened immune resilience across populations. Livestock, which played a crucial role in medieval subsistence, were also deeply affected. Fodder shortages during winter forced many households to slaughter animals earlier than intended, especially cattle and sheep that could not be fed through long cold periods. This practice provided temporary relief in the form of meat, but reduced the number of working and breeding animals in the spring. Archaeological faunal remains show patterns of winter culling that correlate with documented food scarcity. Grain prices, meanwhile, responded directly to seasonal pressures. In many medieval towns, market records reveal rapid price increases during winter months, especially when rumors of poor harvests spread. These fluctuations placed urban populations already dependent on purchased food at heightened risk. The social stratification of access to food became more visible during these periods, with wealthier households securing supplies, while lower-income groups faced hunger or famine-like conditions. These structural weaknesses made winter a decisive factor in determining a community's nutritional stability. When food stores began to run low, mortality increased not only from starvation, but from weakened resistance to disease and the inability to perform labor necessary for survival.
The spread of disease during medieval winters resulted from a combination of environmental, social, and physiological factors that intensified with the arrival of cold weather. Crowded indoor living conditions, limited ventilation, weakened immunity due to poor nutrition, and the absence of medical understanding created conditions in which respiratory and infectious illnesses could propagate rapidly. Contemporary accounts from monasteries and urban centers described waves of winter sickness that recurred annually, often with higher mortality among the very young, the elderly, and those already weakened by food shortages. Cold temperatures encouraged prolonged indoor confinement. Families and laborers gathered around limited heat sources, creating dense clusters of individuals sharing the same air for extended periods.
In a period without germ theory, these enclosed environments enabled the transmission of respiratory diseases such as influenza-like illnesses, pneumonia, and other pulmonary conditions documented in medieval medical texts. Archaeological studies of burial grounds reveal seasonal mortality spikes that align with winter months, indicating the prevalence of disease-related deaths during this season. Ventilation in medieval structures was inconsistent and often inadequate. Houses constructed from wattle and daub, timber, or stone retained smoke from hearth fires, producing significant indoor air pollution. Chronic exposure to smoke weakened respiratory health, making individuals more susceptible to winter illnesses. Written medical treatises from the period frequently discuss chronic coughs, fever episodes, and chest ailments that worsened during the cold months, suggesting that the combination of confined spaces and smoke-heavy environments played a measurable role in disease prevalence. Furthermore, declining hygiene conditions during winter exacerbated the spread of illness. Water sources could freeze or become inaccessible, limiting washing and cleaning practices. Waste disposal systems, already rudimentary, functioned less effectively during snow and frost, causing contamination near living areas. Urban centers, with their dense population and narrow streets, faced even greater challenges, allowing diseases to circulate rapidly through neighborhoods and marketplaces. Nutritional stress also contributed significantly to winter disease dynamics. As food supplies dwindled and diets narrowed, deficiencies in essential nutrients weakened immune responses. Populations consuming primarily grain-based diets without adequate protein or vitamins were more vulnerable to infections, and records from the period describe individuals succumbing to illnesses they might have survived under better nutritional conditions. While medieval winter diseases were not always epidemic in scale, their recurrent presence imposed an annual burden on communities already strained by cold, hunger, and limited mobility. Mortality rose not only from primary infections, but also from complications that modern medicine can treat, but medieval practitioners could not fully understand. With disease acting as an additional structural pressure, the winter season became one of the most dangerous periods of the year for both rural and urban populations.
Isolation during medieval winters emerged as one of the most consequential structural challenges faced by communities across Europe. The combined effects of frozen rivers, impassable roads, heavy snowfall, and shortened daylight hours severely restricted movement between settlements. In regions where communication networks were already limited, winter intensified the inherent fragmentation of medieval geography, creating pockets of population that operated almost entirely cut off from the outside world. Medieval transportation systems were not engineered to withstand winter stress. Roads consisted largely of dirt tracks that transformed into deep mud during thaw periods or became rigid under layers of compacted snow. Bridges, often constructed from timber, were vulnerable to ice accumulation and flooding, conditions that could damage or destroy them. Archaeological surveys of medieval infrastructure reveal recurring patterns of seasonal repair, suggesting that winter consistently disrupted mobility and required communities to allocate labor for reconstruction in the spring. This isolation influenced economic activity as well. Markets that relied on regional exchange experienced interruptions when traders could not travel, causing sharp declines in commercial availability. Urban centers dependent on rural suppliers faced shortages of essential goods, while remote rural communities were entirely dependent on whatever provisions they had stored before the onset of winter. Written charters and local administrative records describe periods when trade routes closed for weeks, preventing the movement of grain, salt, fuel, and livestock. The consequences of isolation extended to governance and social support systems. Feudal authority depended on communication between lords, officials, and dependent communities. Winter slowed or temporarily severed these interactions. Messengers, tax collectors, and ecclesiastical representatives struggled to travel in hazardous conditions. As a result, governance became more localized during colder months, with households and small groups relying on internal resources rather than regional oversight. Religious institutions, which often served as centers of aid, were similarly affected. While monasteries maintained stores and sometimes provided relief, their ability to distribute assistance was constrained by limited mobility. Chronicle entries from monastic centers describe situations in which nearby villages could not reach ecclesiastical aid due to snow-blocked pathways or frozen river crossings. These accounts highlight the spatial fragmentation created by winter and the resulting inequalities in survival outcomes. In essence, medieval winter isolation reveals how geographic and infrastructural limitations intersected with environmental conditions to shape patterns of survival. It demonstrates that the deadly nature of winter arose not only from temperature and scarcity, but also from the absence of connectivity that prevented communities from accessing resources, support, and information.
Infrastructure in the medieval world functioned within narrow technological limits, and winter exposed these limits with striking clarity. Roads deteriorated rapidly under cycles of freezing and thawing, creating ruts deep enough to halt carts and limit overland transport. Archaeological investigations of medieval pathways show layers of compacted mud, stone fragments, and organic material that became brittle in extreme cold, then unstable during sudden warm periods. These patterns reveal how winter repeatedly undermined the basic connective systems on which rural and urban communities depended. Bridges formed another crucial yet vulnerable part of medieval infrastructure. Many were constructed from timber or mixed materials, making them susceptible to ice accumulation, swollen river currents, and frost damage. Written accounts from northern Europe describe winter seasons when river crossings vanished under sheets of ice or collapsed under the pressure of thawing flows. When bridges failed, entire routes shut down, cutting off access to markets, mills, and ecclesiastical centers. Mills, water mills vital to grain processing, were among the most affected structures. During harsh winters, mill wheels froze and water channels clogged with ice, stopping production for weeks at a time. Communities that depended on milled grain faced sudden shortages, especially when manual grinding could not compensate for the loss. Excavations around former mill sites show modifications aimed at mitigating winter stress, including stone-lined channels and attempts to redirect flow, but these solutions provided only partial relief. Housing infrastructure also exhibited structural weaknesses. Medieval dwellings lacked insulation, relied on limited heating sources, and were often built from materials that retained moisture, conditions that allowed cold to penetrate deeply into living spaces. Smoke from hearth fires accumulated due to inadequate ventilation, reducing air quality and contributing to respiratory illness. Timber frames contracted and expanded with temperature changes, causing gaps that amplified heat loss. In harsh winters, these deficiencies created interior environments scarcely warmer than the outdoors. Sanitation systems faced similar constraints. Waste pits froze, drainage slowed, and animal byproducts accumulated near homes, especially when snowbanks restricted movement. These conditions contributed to contamination and increased disease transmission, compounding the challenges introduced by overcrowded indoor living. Urban centers, already struggling with dense populations, experienced the most pronounced effects as waste removal and water access became heavily obstructed. Fuel availability further affected infrastructure performance. Wood scarcity in deforested regions forced households to rely on inferior substitutes such as peat or brushwood, which produced less heat and more smoke. Limited heating not only challenged survival, but also accelerated the deterioration of household structures, as moisture and frost infiltrated walls and foundations. Taken together, these structural vulnerabilities illustrate how medieval winter functioned as a stress mechanism that strained systems already operating near their limits. Rather than a single point of failure, winter exposed a constellation of interconnected weaknesses: transport routes, milling capacity, housing durability, sanitation, and fuel supply, all of which contributed to increased hardship and elevated mortality during the coldest months of the year.
The social impact of medieval winter extended well beyond environmental hardship, influencing the structure, rhythm, and cohesion of communities across Europe.
As temperatures dropped and mobility declined, households became the primary units of survival, shifting daily routines toward internal labor, resource management, and collective endurance. Written records from manorial estates describe winter as a season in which social obligations tightened, and the capacity of families to endure scarcity became a central determinant of health and stability. Labor patterns changed dramatically during winter months. Agricultural work diminished, and in its place, tasks like tool repair, textile production, fuel preparation, and food preservation became essential. These activities reinforced gendered divisions of labor that already characterized medieval society. Women often took on extended responsibilities in food management and household maintenance, while men engaged in repairs, fuel collection, or livestock care. Such divisions were functional responses to environmental pressure rather than cultural abstractions, illustrating how climate shaped social roles. Communal interaction was similarly affected. With travel limited, villages experienced intensified local relationships but weakened regional connections. Seasonal festivals or market gatherings were often reduced or postponed due to severe weather, disrupting the social calendar that organized medieval life. Chronicle entries from monastic centers mention years when winter storms prevented essential gatherings, including legal assemblies or ecclesiastical observances. These interruptions highlight how winter altered the temporal structure of social affairs. Social inequality became more visible during winter. Wealthier households possessed larger storage capacity, better-built homes, and access to more reliable fuel supplies, allowing them to endure harsh conditions with fewer disruptions. Lower-income families, by contrast, faced heightened vulnerability, especially when dependent on day labor or unstable food markets. Records of poor relief distributed by churches and manor lords show an increase in need during winter, reflecting the broader social stratification of survival. Winter also shaped interpersonal behavior and cultural attitudes. In many regions, proverbs, religious rituals, and communal practices developed around the anticipation of winter hardship. These cultural forms functioned as social tools for managing uncertainty, reinforcing cooperation, and structuring expectations. Folkloric traditions, though not used as narrative evidence in modern scholarship, still reflect the psychological and communal weight attributed to winter as a season of trial. The cumulative effect of these social pressures underscores an interconnectedness of medieval life. Environmental stress, economic constraint, labor reorganization, and social stratification converge during winter, revealing the underlying fragility of communities operating without the technological buffers available in later centuries. Winter, therefore, was not only a natural phenomenon, but a social force that shaped identity, behavior, and communal resilience.
Survival during medieval winters depended on a combination of stored resources, communal support structures, technological improvisation, and the capacity of households to adapt to environmental pressure. While no single strategy guaranteed safety, historical and archaeological evidence reveals a series of practices that communities employed to navigate the season's challenges. These methods reflected not only material necessity, but also cultural knowledge accumulated across generations. Food preservation remained central to winter survival. Grain storage in wooden or stone-lined silos, drying of legumes, salting of meat, and preparation of fermented foods provided essential calories when fresh produce disappeared from the landscape. Excavations of medieval settlements reveal storage pits, ceramic vessels, and smokehouses that indicate the sophistication of these preservation systems. Nevertheless, poor yields or inadequate protection from moisture or pests could undermine even the most careful preparations, leaving households vulnerable as winter progressed. Heating strategies were similarly constrained by technology and environment. Hearth fires supplied limited warmth, and the inefficiency of medieval chimneys caused smoke to accumulate indoors, reducing air quality but preventing heat loss. Communities adjusted by restricting activity to smaller, concentrated living spaces during cold months. Clothing, often made from wool, played a significant role in retaining body heat, though its effectiveness varied according to social status and access to high-quality materials. Livestock management formed another component of winter survival.
Animals were sheltered in barns or attached structures that provided warmth for both humans and livestock, while manure contributed to composting systems used in spring agriculture. Fodder management, however, remained a constant challenge. Shortages forced early slaughter, affecting milk availability and plowing capacity in the coming seasons. This interdependence between winter practices and future agricultural productivity underscores the cyclical nature of medieval survival strategies. Social networks functioned as an essential buffer against winter hardship. Communal grain reserves, monastic charity, and neighbor assistance appear frequently in written accounts, indicating that collective resilience often determined the fate of entire communities. In regions where isolation was severe, reciprocal aid systems helped distribute limited resources more evenly, though not without tensions arising from scarcity. Parish records from Northern Europe document seasonal appeals for relief, demonstrating the structured role of the church in mitigating winter vulnerability. Adaptation to winter also took cultural forms. Knowledge of seasonal patterns shaped agricultural calendars, building practices, and local customs designed to anticipate and endure hardship. While not always sufficient to prevent mortality, these practices reveal an understanding of environmental rhythms and a long-term attempt to sustain life within the constraints of the medieval climatic and technological landscape. Ultimately, survival in medieval winter was a negotiation between environmental forces and human capability. It depended on the interaction of food stores, shelter, community cohesion, and inherited cultural knowledge. The deadly nature of the season emerged from the failure of these systems to meet the pressures imposed by cold, scarcity, and isolation. Examining these survival strategies offers insight not only into medieval life, but into the broader dynamics of pre-modern societies confronting environmental extremes.